Good morning, afternoon, and evening. Welcome to the CSS Web Talk on Foreign Disinformation Risks and Responses. My name is Stefan Susanto. I'm a senior researcher and lead the cyber defense team here at the Center for Security Studies at ETH Zurich. Since we have quite a lot of attendees from outside Switzerland, let me briefly introduce the CSS. So the Center for Security Studies was founded back in 1986 and is the national center of competence for Swiss and international security policy. There are around 50 researchers working at the center, separated into a think tank side, an academic side, and a PhD candidate cohort. The topic of today's web talk is not the easiest to talk about. Foreign disinformation touches upon the very foundations of how information and knowledge is created, how it flows across borders, how it is ingested domestically, and how it can harden and reshape beliefs, perceptions, opinions, political discourse, and even reality itself. Take a step back and ask yourself, what did you think back in 2020? When 51 former US intelligence officials claimed that the Hunter Biden laptop was Russian disinformation? What do you know about last year when Romania's constitutional court annulled the outcome of the first round of the presidential election and banned the winning candidate because of Russian election interference? And what do you feel is right, wrong, true, false, lawful, and unlawful when it comes to Israel's military operation in Gaza? Thankfully, none of this is my problem today, as we have our own Yasha Heinen guiding us through the next 90 minutes. And with Gavin Wild and Bennett Zock, we have two eloquent speakers that will share their views and expertise on how governments are dealing with disinformation. So grab a snack and something to drink and enjoy this web talk. Yasha, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much as well from us. Good morning, evening, or afternoon, wherever this reaches you. Hi, and welcome to this webinar on foreign disinformation risks and responses. And already a great thank you to you, Stefan, for a fantastic introduction that already gives us a good basis from which we can dive into two quite specific areas, being risks and being responses. We've picked these because governments face complex questions in both of these fields. Is foreign disinformation a threat, and why? How can we assess this danger without overestimating or underestimating it? How do we respond to it is a whole other question. Is there a set of effective measures? Do we risk making matters worse? And how do we not only act against, but also talk about disinformation? These topics and a couple more will be the focus of today. Luckily, I do not have to tackle them alone, but am joined by two fantastic guests who I would now to very briefly introduce to you guys. First is Gavin Wild. Gavin is non-resident fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. His expertise is on Russia, as well as on cyber and influence operations, on propaganda and emerging technologies, one of them being AI. I'm very sure we'll delve into this as we speak. Before his time at Carnegie, Gavin worked for the National Security Council and was part of the US intelligence community for almost 15 years. Gavin, it's fantastic to have you here.
I'm very grateful to be here. Thanks so much.
Right. I would also love to introduce Benno Zog. Benno is the head of strategic affairs and foresight at the State Secretariat for Security Policy of the Swiss Department of Defense, Civil Protection and Sport. In this role, one of his focal points is disinformation, as well as influence activities more generally. Before his time in the administration, Benno was a think tanker and thus focused on Eastern European security policy and specifically on tensions in and around Ukraine, both before and after Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. Benno, it is great to have you here as well.
Thank you, Yasha.
You do see, of course, that both our guests kind of combine theory and practice. They have been advantaging and tackling disinformation and foreign disinformation, particularly from numerous vantage points. And so I'm very happy to dive in with you to maybe give you an idea what the next 60 to 65 minutes are going to look like. We'll go from risks to responses quite chronologically and then open up the floor for questions. You, dear viewers, can participate in a Q&A, whether it's a question that you've had for a while now or something that comes up during our talk. Feel free to post it in the Q&A session and we'll try to get to as many as we can. For now, though, let us start with risks and a kind of double two-part question to both of you. Gavin, I would like to start with you. I was wondering in this very fast section whether we could talk about misperceptions, about things that we get wrong when it comes to risks of disinformation. At the same time, however, I thought that sometimes that whole term disinformation is a bit nebulous. And so I wanted to make it more concrete. Stefan has already given us a couple of examples. But could you firstly start us off maybe with an example of a foreign influence operation that stuck with you, whether it was particularly effective or ineffective, or whether it taught you something more fundamental about foreign disinformation? That's one thing. And could you secondly talk to us a bit, what, in your opinion, is the most overrated risk concerning foreign disinformation?
Yeah, so luckily, I think for the purposes of this question, I've got an example that kind of hits on all of those themes. And I think it's in terms of the doppelganger operation. So since at least 2022, a Russian organization called the Social Design Agency, or SDA as a shorthand, undertook this prolific scheme to plant fake articles, videos, polls, other materials using clones of popular websites and spam and clickbait. And the organization operated under the apparent direction of Kremlin officials with a budget of tens of millions of dollars, focusing on political and cultural issues across the US and Europe and Ukraine and elsewhere. And more recently, it even began incorporating ChatGPT into its tactics. And this is one of the most widespread online propaganda operations ever uncovered. So in terms of a classical foreign disinformation op, it probably belongs in the Hall of Fame. And these guys set very lofty goals for themselves, including lessening Biden's approval ratings and diminishing American public support for Ukraine. Never mind the fact for the moment that it would be impossible to demonstrate any real causal link between those outcomes and a bunch of fake websites. Let's bookmark that point for later. Even so, they kept close tabs on all aspects of their operations and the engagement metrics. Meanwhile, after this was discovered by Western researchers and exposed by Western journalists, Doppelganger became perhaps the most intensely studied and sanctioned and criminally implicated propaganda operations in modern history. And the SDA also carefully tracked and translated and summarized all of this coverage themselves. And in the end, everyone in the story came to the same conclusion, including the social media platforms and the SDA itself. The Western coverage of Doppelganger got more traction than the Doppelganger campaign itself ever did, by orders of magnitude. The latter metrics were hardly impressive, but the former ones became the marketing materials that helped the SDA keep itself in business. So in other words, Doppelganger didn't continue operating and receiving backing from the Kremlin despite being exposed, but rather because it kept being exposed. And so now we have this perverse situation where both foreign propagandists and Western counter-propagandists continue to chase funding and political backing by portraying online propaganda as something far more decisive and impactful than any of the empirical research has ever really been able to validate. In fact, a great deal of research in previous years has shown that most of these types of operations are either mostly ignored or simply preached to a choir of the already deeply converted. So I think, just to sum up, in a real way, foreign propaganda is not as much designed to sway audiences abroad as it is to gain funding and clout at home. And that's really the only major way that it is effective. And to the extent that we in the West hyperventilate and over-securitize about these operations, we share the blame for that. So in other words, the bad guys may play the tune, but we tend to provide the volume.
Okay, and dance along the music, so to speak, in that case. I see. Okay, I think we will definitely go deeper into this question of how to also talk about disinformation, because if it is the coverage that really matters, we must be aware of whether and how to talk about it. Thank you very much for that opening statement. Benno, for someone who kind of works in government right now and has now just heard that, you know, what we do and how we respond might be quite important, I would nevertheless ask you to maybe also give us an example that is striking for you, maybe for different reasons, maybe with a Swiss context, maybe not. I would love to hear, of course, feel free to respond to Gavin as well, From you and the government perspective, I would also love to hear, apart from this example, do you think there are things that we are not worried about enough? Are there things in all of this hype, in all of this focus on the influence operation itself, that we might be underestimating?
I'll try. Thanks. A specific example that I can think of is a Swiss one, actually, but it indicates quite a few things that I think are important about all of that. Gavin may not have heard of it because it never gained massive traction or so, but I think that the case is still interesting. Let's picture the setting. It was in the winter of 2022 to 2023. It was a cold winter. Russia had obviously just recently attacked Ukraine. There was general talk in political debates about energy shortages of gas in particular. And in social media, a photo appeared in various channels, a photo of a billboard somewhere standing in a street of Switzerland, not a specific one. And the billboard said the following. It had a woman with a telephone in her hand, and it says, "Is your neighbor heating too much? Call and get a reward. Signed, the Swiss Department of Environment and Energy." It essentially called on citizens to call out their neighbors who were apparently heating too much, which the billboard indicated is somewhat illegal or shouldn't happen. The whole billboard and the photo of the billboard were fake, AI generated possibly, or Photoshop or whatever. Switzerland never had the energy shortages that this photo implied, and there were certainly no rules at the time or later or before that against heating in any kind of way, let alone rewards for anyone calling out on neighbors. That's fairly alien to our system, so it wouldn't be very believable. Why I use this example, I think it's striking for a number of reasons. First of all, it picked up a controversial topic at the time. It was the real worry of energy shortages, of gas, but also electricity. It came in a context of an intense phase of Russia's war against Ukraine, where all of this was, of course, amplified. And it tried to sow mistrust within society, as in you calling out your neighbor, and the only non-fake part about the whole campaign was the telephone number that was indicated on the billboard. It was actually from the State Secretariat, from the General Secretariat of the Department for Environment and Energy, which received dozens of calls. Dozens, not hundreds. And I assume most of those calls were by confused or alienated citizens and not by the ones who were just calling out on their neighbors for heating too much. Let alone, of course, the fact that the whole campaign, which didn't last for too long, was attributed to actors close to the Russian state. I think that's another element, obviously, of what we're talking about. And going back to your general question, Yasha, and what Gavin said earlier, whether we under or overestimate the risk, I feel like the line between the two is very hard, and we have elements of both, I would certainly say. To take the underestimation path, let's say we are underestimating the threat. I'm trying to picture a situation where, let's say, the winter of 2022 to 23 could have been even harsher. Energy storage could have been more limited. There could actually have been any kind of limitation to energy consumption. This is a very extreme measure, but could have been taken. And let's say Switzerland had a vote ahead as well of certain geopolitical importance. For example, a popular vote on nuclear energy, a ban on it or not. Had all these factors come into play, which they could have, Switzerland does vote all the time on these things, the effect of such a campaign with a billboard, if it's spread through the right channels and picked up by the right kind of media and platforms, could have been much stronger. Mm-hmm. And there, I think the important factor is we're talking about disinformation just now, but it's never only disinformation. It's part of wider policy debates. It is usually disinformation being just one tool in a toolbox that is employed usually at the same time. It can be cyber measures. It can be sabotage, acts of sabotage happening at the same time. Imagine some kind of electricity facility being targeted by a small bomb at the same time. So the compounding effects of all of that is, I think, what we should worry about. And just the last point, I don't think we've seen the maximum of what disinformation can do just yet. You could employ technology and will come to it in much more intricate ways and more widely, you could probably invest even more into this coordinated campaigns that include disinformation. So I feel like if we want to prepare for the worst, where the constellation of these factors to be even less in our favor, to prepare for that, I think we should take it really seriously.
Okay, I see. So there are aspects, I think I really like what you're touching on there, right? It is possible entirely that we both not underestimate disinformation, foreign disinformation in certain ways. If I understand correctly, it's this notion of having a kernel of truth that may make this information really difficult. And it might be particularly effective if there is a lot on the line, if we kind of move the needle. You did, however, at the very end of your contribution, bring out a very important point, which is that things might be different now. We haven't seen the maximum now because there's a whole new era, maybe, of technological components. And this brings us to a quite important question, being what actually is new about foreign disinformation? This issue that we want to deceive the enemy, or that the enemy should be deceived with wrongful, incomplete, misleading information, that is something that is not only as old as the Cold War, it is as old as people have fought wars, which means it is as old as people. And still, there's great worry that technological innovation, and specifically social media and the rise of algorithmic bubbles, as well as generative AI, I think the big elephant in the room, have fundamentally changed the game. Whereas other people say, no, this is basically business as usual. We had the same thing with other technology. What I would really like to know from both of you is whether you believe that anything about modern disinformation, if we can call it that, is really new. And if so, if it makes disinformation more dangerous. Whoever of you wants to take it. Maybe starting with you, Benno.
I would agree generally with your statement, as in it is not new, it's always existed. But of course, the specific context that it feeds on, the specific societal and political constellations at the time are different each time. And the channels, methods, technologies that are used, the intentions behind it are always very specific to a specific point of time. So I don't think and even were it not new at all, nothing about it would be new. It will still be a current threat. We would still have to deal with it right now in the right kind of way, given our political system and the urgency that there is. So I think artificial intelligence, which we all have mentioned, is a factor in that. It just makes the production, the dissemination, the micro-targeting possibly of certain audiences much easier. I still think, and I go with Gavin there, it's not that easy to reach a very specific effect with a very specific audience that you may have in mind. Much of that may be overstatement as well. And the indirect effects that you have by classical media picking it up, by generally triggering a wider debate and creating more indirect general effects, let's say, of a lack of trust in information or institutions or media and so on, is probably more important. But I also think this isn't generally new. That's also how old propaganda campaigns were done. In the hopeful case for research and academia, but also as policymakers, I would argue, if it isn't that new, we can probably learn from the past and find the right calibrated measures at the moment, tailored to the specific situation that we're in.
Yeah, exactly. Do you agree, Gavin? Do you also think that this is a continuation of something from which also means that we can learn from and adapt, or is this a whole new game changer?
I think broadly I would agree with that sentiment. I think the global speed and the global scale is indeed new, and it means that affinity groups, allegiances, patriotisms, causes that we decide to align ourselves with are not just limited now to our hometown or even our fellow countrymen or fellow newsletter readers, but now can be truly global in reach and quickly. But then again, I would characterize foreign disinformation as a symptom of that changing world, less necessarily a proximate cause of it. And I think, you hit on certainly something that I think I would love researchers to kind of be mindful of is this mythology, if I can use the term, if not myth, that somehow technology and online metrics operate as a bit of a Rosetta Stone for the phenomenon of human suasion, we've seen this idea play out from, Cambridge Analytica to the social dilemma. But at its core, I think this idea of kind of psychometric targeting is basically a bit of marketing for tech companies and advertisers that's now dressed up as social science, a bit of a temptation towards positivism or physics envy, whereby we assume not only that human psychology and relationships behave according to some kind of underlying generalized laws like physics or chemistry, but that online metrics are somehow the key to unlocking those laws. The truth is, I think human beings are simply more complex than that, and their online behaviors are but one small piece of a very, very large and complicated puzzle. And so when we cast beliefs and behaviors as a byproduct of media diets alone, completely discounting lived experience in the physical world, it's a bit like, as I've written, it's a bit like understanding the plot of a movie by staring into the projector. And it's not necessarily a new idea. They used to simply call it behaviorism, this notion that humans can be conditioned to behave in uniform ways like a lab rat or Pavlov's dogs. Now, again, it's just been wrapped in the language of algorithm and apps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's not going to change. So we are not poor atoms that are just being influenced by foreign disinformation to do whatever. Okay, I see. So where there are over and underestimated aspects, and while things might be novel in spread, in speed, in quantity, we are not in front of a whole new dimension. I think this is quite interesting. Maybe still going from foreign disinformation as a weapon or tool that we've now talked about to us, to the responding government. Whether something is a threat, and that's what we talk about here when we talk about risks, does not only depend on how dangerous a weapon is or a vector, but also about how well a government is at defending itself against whatever danger is out there. And so I think I would really love to touch not only on disinformation itself, but also on, let's say, defending or at least exposed governments and societies as well. And I would love to ask the question and get a bit of a better understanding of, you said it earlier, Benno, there's always a particular context, there's always a particular story, and there's always a particular target of foreign disinformation. What makes a target? What makes a society particularly vulnerable against foreign disinformation campaigns, or on the contrary, particularly resilient against it?
Mm-hmm. I think for the reasons that Gavin has indicated, that is very hard to answer because the effects of specific disinformation is very hard to measure. And opinion forming, political behavior, general behavior of a society on certain issues in public space and so on is determined by so many factors, whereas even the information space as such, whether it's the online or offline, is only part of it, let alone then the disinformation space or specific disinformation pieces to narrow it down even further. So that's very hard. For the same reason, maybe starting with the bit of research that I know or that has studied certain effects on that, I'm sure Gavin can add. It's not that clear a pattern. There isn't a specific group of society that is super vulnerable, whereas others aren't. There aren't certain methods or content or themes or so that work super well, whereas others don't. I think the general idea, of course, you take topics topics, attitudes, cultural values, whatever debate that is controversial, ideally already is controversial. You don't have to create the controversy, but is already there. So you use a certain core that already exists, that possibly appeals to or speaks to people's emotions, ideally to increase those a little. That can help, and you probably reach people who have an already lower level of trust in institutions, in the state, in their neighbors, and so on already, who are certainly more prone to what we may call conspiracy narratives. So those are possibly more vulnerable than others when it comes to specific content. There were a few studies. Some indicated, in a Swiss context actually, there were experiments, because isolating the effect is so hard. Experiments, for example, where people were presented with regular newspaper articles, some articles that had a paid post at the bottom, and some that were complete bollocks. To what extent they were able to identify what they saw. And in that specific experiment that I'm citing, older generations fared actually fairly poorly, or let's say worse than many, let's say the 20 to 30-year-olds, the one which we probably see as the most vulnerable ones because they consume social media all day and their life consists of 10-second TikTok videos. This is just a stereotype, of course. But the older ones fared fairly poorly. I think we have a contrast there if we really generalize, which is old people have always had faith in media. They would watch TV and it would be everything what they would see would be reality. Everything they would read in the newspaper, they would perceive as reality. So older generations believing everything they see, whereas young people probably believe nothing they see because they know it's all a big mess. It's all social media. In the end, they rather do not believe in any information regardless of where it's coming from. I'm being super simplistic, of course, but I think there's some elements there. And long story short, that of course makes a response about how to make such a society more resilient, more able to detect disinformation, to ignore it, ideally, makes it fairly hard. But I would hope that Gavin and the research world has a few recipes for us. I'll take notes.
Well, I think I agree with everything that Benno has outlined. I think certainly a sense of apathy or helplessness about leaders and elites and institutions make fertile ground or easy targets for foreign propagandists, and that kind of has a self-reinforcing cycle inherent to it. But I also think that's why it's important that our conversations about resilience toward foreign propaganda start by taking stock of what is happening at home in citizens' real-world lived experiences and kind of place their media diets much, much further down the list. So some of the research that Aaron Ehrlich and others at McGill University, I believe, did in the Ukraine context found, unsurprisingly, that as the Ukrainian government started to tackle corruption post-2014, the resonance of those kind of foreign propaganda narratives being sown by Russia about Ukrainian corruption started to be less resonant in Ukrainian society. So if we ask ourselves kind of how represented does the populace feel by their elected officials, how responsive are the institutions to their daily, very practical needs, how equal do they feel compared to the wealthy and the politically connected? So I think there's a real risk of getting it backwards when we conflate a foreign power capitalizing on local vulnerabilities versus causing those vulnerabilities. And in the process, we absolve our leaders for their responsibility to improve things. And I think Ukraine presents a very interesting and very simple test case of, as you improve the lot of daily lived experience, the resonance of those narratives tends to diminish.
I think this actually brings us perfectly into our second topic, and actually we will start with a follow-up question for you there, because it seems like if it is true that what you need to do is kind of get the wind out of the sails, as you say in German, kind of, if you try to counter disinformation by making the conditions better, by improving the conditions so that there is nothing to disinform around, if there's a kernel of distrust that needs to be there, and you building up trust is a way of actually combating disinformation, does that mean we are better off at combating disinformation by combating it less, by focusing on other things in that case?
That would be my prescription. I think it's too often a distraction from homegrown problems, conveniently sometimes for our own national leaders. I think it's in the case of Russia, it has long been a scapegoat for governance failings, where popular dissatisfaction can just be waved off as the product of foreign propaganda, and we've seen that in countries all over the world where that becomes an easy go-to. And so I think if we hold our own elites, our own leaders, our own institutions as accountable for the tone and tenor of our politics, as we tend to want to hold Beijing and Moscow, certainly in the US context, I think that changes the conversation somewhat around the kind of urgency that we put on foreign disinformation, certainly online.
Okay, so what one don't would be to really kind of over focus on foreign disinformation as the big bad that kind of creates everything. For you, Benno, coming from, again, a governmental perspective, obviously not shifting blame is, or like shifting blame is one big don't. Is there anything else that you look at as a red flag, so to speak, when it comes to governmental actions? Is there something that you as the government have decided we will not implement this because there's such a risk of it blowing back, of it making matters worse? Is there a don't you can give as well?
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't be as strict as a complete don't, but maybe a rather not or a rarely do or so, which would be reaction to begin with. Reaction implies, well, me, let's say I work as a civil servant. When I see a lie about our work, a content of our work, and so on, my immediate reaction is, of course, I want to rectify it. I want to speak the truth. I want to inform people about what we're doing, not as in a too propagandistic way, but just generally straightening the facts. That is understandable, that is human, but it's probably usually not the right policy. Once the narrative is out there, it's kind of already too late. If it resonates, then you have made a structural mistake before. If it doesn't resonate, don't amplify it and don't retweet in a way. Even if you add a fact-checking bit to it, even if you counter it with facts, you have still repeated the nonsense. And we know from psychology, it's a very simple human feature that the more often you hear nonsense, even if everyone says it's nonsense, as in, let me tell you the following lie, and then I'll tell you the lie, and then I'll tell you 10 times a day, you will still believe it more, even if you know, or I've told you that it's a lie. So hence this reaction issue is one thing. Hence we focus on also as a Swiss government, as Gavin has hinted at the structural factors and generally at prevention and resilience. The Swiss political system is a bit particular because we have at national, at state, and at local level, regular, around 4 times a year, popular votes on all kinds of issues, plus elections of our deputies anyway. That means our citizens need to be constantly informed well about, just to give them the basis for their political decisions. There's dozens of votes each citizen has to take each year. That is a potential vulnerability. If there's certain votes that some powers may be interested in, then they could be attacked, even though we haven't had any evidence of that specifically happening. And at the same time, the whole core of our political system rests on citizens that are informed, that are critical, that can assess individual policy issues one by one, because you vote yes or no on individual policy issues, not just general votes. Hence, the logic of the Swiss state is we inform continuously, transparently, through trusted figures. Those are our ministers of cabinet, for example, in press conferences and others. And that in the end is the bedrock of what our society and our democracy rests on. And we have these informed critical citizens. That also means, of course, it starts with education as everything. So elements of media literacy and political literacy starting at any level in all education levels is important. And there, just to add one element to it, of course, that is a very continuous and somewhat passive policy. It is not a specific one. It's not a reactive one for specific elements of disinformation. And it's not an easy one, because it means that continuously as a state, as our political leaders, you need to reach audiences. You need to have the right kind of messages that are fact-based, that convince people, and people must listen to you. They don't have to listen to you because they have to vote the same way you recommend them to, but at least listen to us. This is the issue. This is what you're voting on. These are the arguments for or against. Make up your minds. And then we trust our citizens to make up their mind. And in the end, this will always remain. There will always remain an open space for debate. We are a free society. We cannot close that off. This is our highest good and value that we have. So in the end, what it leaves with is citizens being equipped enough to be fully autonomous in their decision making, let alone our political leaders as well, who are even more important in that decision making. And we can't shelter them from disinformation either. This is what we have to live with. Certain states do it much easier. They just shut off the internet altogether. Then no information comes in. But even that is very tricky these days.
No, definitely, with like VPNs and everything going out. What I think was really interesting is we have not really spoken about specific countermeasures right now. We have not brought up internet shutdowns or fact-checking sites, whatever. What is really interesting is this consensus that it is not as much even what we actually do against it, but how we do it. That is one big part. And the other one is, it seems like it is more important to what we do every single day consistently rather than how and whether we even react to foreign disinformation. I think this is quite interesting. It seems to be about being a society, a government that works, that has trust in both directions. I really loved when you said, Benno, that it is important that the state can trust citizens. So it's not just about citizens being willing to believe that what the state tells them is true. It's also about the state being willing to trust that citizens will be able to make correct decisions based on a larger amount of fact, which is quite interesting because it kind of goes away from a discussion that is held a lot about whether fact-checking works or not, to what degree education works or not, because it seems like it's more fundamentally important that government shows up. It seems it's fundamentally more important that trust is slowly but steadily built rather than government showing up to fight a particular campaign. I would nevertheless, because I think it's very interesting and I think it gives us a good example of some kind of countermeasure, focus on a specific example. Maybe it's not something that you, Gavin, know, but it is a very Swiss example as well. The Swiss Federal Council is currently working on a so-called Bundesrat, or Federal Council app, through which it can directly communicate with citizens. And the expressed goal is to, quote, allow the Federal Council and the federal administration to reach citizens even during crises and disinformation campaigns and influence operations. This is not a complete countermeasure. It's also there during crises. I think it goes into what you have said, Benno. It's not some kind of response, but a continuous flow of information. But we've said numerous times now, and I think it started with the doppelganger operation that you brought up, Gavin, that the way we talk about this issue really, really matters. That it's really important how we talk about this. And so if we get into our heads and we try to picture a situation where Switzerland or any other government that has such a direct mean of communication is enraptured in an influence campaign, what is it then that you would recommend to the authors of these press releases? How do you balance, I would say, the need to tone it down without overhyping, but also without downplaying the issue?
Mm-hmm. I can't foot stomp enough and applaud enough Benno's point that, as much as we are worried about citizens losing trust in institutions, I think the pendulum is now on the other side, where I worry most that our institutions, in large part because of this conversation we have about FEME and about disinformation, that our institutions don't lose that very trust in their citizens. That's why I very much dislike the term manipulation, because it assumes a lot of blank slate in our publics that is simply not the case. So I think I would applaud this effort with a few caveats that as long as government officials view transparent and robust communication as the debt that they owe to their citizens, rather than as a way to extrude some kind of behavior from them or steer them in some way, that's the key to the key aspect. Because if it's designed to surreptitiously steer a behavior that otherwise would not have occurred, I think that's where you start to dip into a little bit more of an autocratic or technocratic approach that's counterproductive. If it's instead designed foremost out of a desire for public safety, for transparency, to kind of lend, as Benno says, lend the public the benefit of the doubt that I'm informing you about an issue and I have accepted that you are a rational being. Rational doesn't always equal right, but that you, the public, are rational, deliberative beings, and the chips will fall where they may. And I think that's the price that we pay for a deliberative democracy, is that acceptance that our citizens may not always make the correct choice, but they are not as gullible as perhaps the conversation we've had about disinformation has led us to believe. So I think part of that is also, insofar as government officials want to warn about disinformation or foreign propaganda, we need to adopt, I think, more of a meta critique. Talk about it as an ideology, as a hustle, as a Ponzi scheme, right? As a con job that victimizes both its funders and political backers and the public every bit as equally. Because online disinformation is, in fact, the Ponzi scheme of cognitive and social science. It strips people of agency. It passes that agency on to quote unquote narratives or algorithms instead. It rules out the idea of organically occurring public sentiment. It absolves our leaders of responsibility and lends our adversaries an awful lot of unearned credit for what are at their core very complex, if not unknowable, phenomena. So just like we wouldn't address Ponzi schemes by trying to debunk every vitamin supplement or face cream that's on sale, we also shouldn't try to address foreign propaganda from the perspective of narrative or subject matter, but instead, again, adopting that meta critique about what is really an autocratic philosophy that underlines foreign propaganda, the mythology of manipulation itself.
Okay. And so how in that case, if this kind of meta critique would be administered, this still needs to be communicated in a way. So does that mean, if we said we don't want to talk about every individual vitamin Ponzi scheme, does that mean that the Bundesrat app, which again was specifically designed to also allow the Bundesrat to communicate in terms of and in times of disinformation campaigns, it would be as close to business as usual as possible, or it would, how would that kind of translate? I do understand your point, and I wholeheartedly agree with it, but how do I, as a poor press release writer, try to implement this?
So I think one of the best examples I've seen in an American context was in 2018, I believe, or 2020. There was a campaign by the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, that was called Pineapple on Pizza, that was designed to educate about a debate that's near and dear to the heart of every American pizza lover. And it was designed to educate voters about disingenuous or false information that's used to mudsling during a political campaign. And it educated the public about disinformation in a way that didn't have to say the words disinformation. It didn't have to say the words election. It brought in something from a very kind of benign and playful and educating tone that didn't come off as condescending or patronizing or manipulative, but rather just, hey, public, we're about to enter an election season. Here are some things to be aware of. Here are some things that you may encounter on social media, that you may encounter online. Here are some tips to help you make better informed decisions. Completely apolitical, completely nonpartisan, but very enlightening and not too kind of hectoring or lecturing in tone. That, I think, was a great example of something that worked well to enable those who had a desire to be more media literate to do so and find resources that they may not have otherwise found, or to think about the problem in a way that they might not have otherwise considered.
If I can comment on that, I like that idea very much, and I think that would speak to a Swiss audience as well, and would be, let's say, in line with what general Swiss politics, Swiss government communication works. The Bundesrat's app is still being conceptualized, being designed. It is not implemented yet. The government obviously has many other channels. I mean, I follow our government on Instagram, for example. That's not a recommendation necessarily, and that's one. We have Alert Swiss, which is an app for actual alerts that can be natural disaster in a certain region and so on and so forth. So there's loads of channels. And I think most of the time, 80 or 90% of the time, whether it's a Bundesratsapp or gov.ch on Instagram and so on, it will be fed with exactly what a government does, which is continuously informing what it does, what visits it has done, trying to make very complex policy issues digestible or explain it to the extent possible, not even related to a specific vote, just generally saying, this is what we're doing, this is our work, this is important. That also means that 80% of these channels will be fairly boring, because to a general audience, it is not sensationalist, it isn't always the big action, it isn't always the big manipulation that we need to counter. Selectively, it will be able to use these channels for the kind of awareness campaign that Gavin has mentioned, or for an actual reaction if warranted. Let's say there is actual confusion based on certain disinformation that is spreading in all kinds of ways. Citizens behave in a certain way, they come out to the streets, they're not sure how to act and who to talk to. Then of course the government can use these channels to inform, but that would be very, very selective for all the reasons that we've discussed earlier.
Yeah, I really like what you say there, that parts of this, a lot of these channels already exist, and that these channels do have a kind of boring tone to them. And maybe that's exactly it, right? Maybe daring to be boring is actually a quite important part of this, right? Not kind of falling into this trap of viewing.
We're Switzerland, we're very good at that. We're not exciting in any way.
But it seems to be something that could be used beyond the Swiss Rust. It's more than just applesauce on Rusty or pineapple on pizza. It seems to be something that, in general, would be a fantastic way to rhetorically kind of approach the issue of disinformation, which in itself often is very emotive, which in itself very often is very quite insane, frankly, at times in the way that it makes its posts. I really like this. The kind of dare to be boring, I think, is really good, and I love this as a kind of takeaway. Maybe speaking of takeaways, before we go into the Q&A session, to which I'm really looking forward, both with my questions that I've had as well as our audiences, I would like to take a step back. We've talked about what governments do or can do. We've mostly focused on them as actors. However, sitting here are around 60, 70 people. We are individuals. We are maybe not always torrented and exposed to disinformation all the time. However, it seems that we as individuals, obviously, a lot of the things that we've talked about here could be applicable to us as well, how we approach it, how we view it. If we take a step back from the government and really focus on us, the individual, what is something that you two, who are in the business of analyzing things through the lens of the government or advise the governments on it, do you have one piece of advice, not to governments, not even to media actors or academics, we might get into that later, but to individuals on how to think about and approach the issue of disinformation in their daily lives?
Maybe just an idea to start with. Obviously, everyone who is in this webinar is already on the right path. That is evident. Minus the 2 or 3 who may be in this webinar for sketchy reasons. That's part of open debate and open societies. I would repeat what we said earlier, as in, don't panic, don't give specific content or disinformation and the actors behind it too much room, the room they don't deserve, but the room that they want. They're calling for our attention. That is their ultimate goal. The more people heard about it, the more people worry about it, the more people feel like, oh, maybe the last election, which wasn't in my favor anyway, was maybe possibly manipulated or due to disinformation, so not part of a genuine discourse. The more they have achieved their goal. At the same time, of course, if there is genuine manipulation, either of opinions or of the technology behind elections, then of course it should be massively investigated. So I'd mostly call on people's mostly online but also offline behavior, as in, take this seriously, be aware that it is happening. Somebody is trying to manipulate. Somebody is perceiving us as empty vessels where like a flip can or a button can be pushed if we're fed the right kind of narratives that we behave in a certain way. these people are out there and they're trying to target us every single day, but that doesn't mean they're succeeding. That doesn't mean they're succeeding in the exact kind of ways that they're intending. Their effect is there, but probably more limited than they would hope for. Let's keep it at that, and stay critical citizens who mostly go about their usual way and don't spread this stuff. And again, even if you spread it with the comment of, look at what kind of nonsense I just saw, it's still probably wrong to spread it. That would be like that's how I try to behave online and offline as well.
Yeah. No, I see, definitely. How do you behave, Gavin? And how would you love others to behave as well?
You know, the biggest lesson I think I tell students and colleagues and policymakers, having worked on, you know, the Russian side of this problem set for a long time, is that you know, we talk about the need to factor for our inherent biases when we're doing research or when we're doing policymaking. And so the rule of thumb that I think I've come up with that I try to adopt and try to spread is that it is not possible to study information without objectifying humans. And that is a bias that we have to be aware of and do a much better job of controlling for. So let me just repeat that. It is not possible to study information without objectifying humans in the process. And so I think that will help us in the future. And we can start now, as Benno says, to recenter human beings in the discussion rather than the information or the technology in that conversation. Because if you start from the vantage point that this is a human being problem and these are that the human being is the center of it, I think it brings you to a much more constructive place.
I see. Kind of both shifting the focus and again keeping the human element in all of this. Absolutely fantastic. It's also very good life advice in general, if I might be so frank. Let us now, however, for the next 20 minutes, so we do definitely have time, go and move on what our audience thinks of what our audience is very much interesting and interested. One thing maybe to already start with an American example. We've talked a bit about Switzerland a fair bit. There's also a specific question for Gavin on the US example, which is, do you see any practical implication from President Trump's decision to halt some of the efforts of US intelligence to counter Russian disinformation, sabotage, etc.? For instance, not coordinating with Europe anymore. Which means, do you observe an increase in Russian disinformation in the US, more fake news? So basically, now that Trump has seemingly halted anti-disinformation measures, do we see a flood coming in?
I don't know that I could answer that with any fidelity. I mean, it's very hard to measure, obviously, and it's probably an unknowable proposition for a variety of different reasons. What I will say is that in terms of the problems that the United States faces with Russia, in that it is a nuclear-armed adversary that entails a lot of different security threats, in cyberspace and in physical space. My personal view is that resources, particularly by the US intelligence community or the national security apparatus, that are spent trying to tackle online disinformation on the range of issues that we need to deal with that are related to Russia, they're probably much, much further down the list than I think we've treated them in the last few years. And so in that regard, I think there is a good reason to kind of recalibrate what issues we decide to focus on in terms of Russia and security issues.
I see. And really being aware of the opportunity costs, right? That every personnel, every hour, everything that we spend on this, we can't spend on the other.
Indeed. And I think there is a certain degree as well to which there is no reason to spend federal government resources trying to replicate or perform functions that academia and the think tank community and NGOs have proven very adept at. Again, going back to Doppelganger, it was not, the EU Disinfo Lab can do a hell of a lot better than anyone at the National Security Council or NSA could do on disinformation. I would bet that to be the case.
Okay, so a very nice shout out at this point for the EU versus Disinfo project. I think this brings us quite naturally, though, then to another question that's been asked to both of you as well, which is the why of it all. We've spoken now about how effects are really difficult to measure, and they are not only difficult to measure for us, they're also difficult to measure for actors who decide to engage in disinformation. So one of the main questions is why this is being done at the first place. That's something we haven't really focused on. And one attendee is asking exactly this: what strategic objectives might foreign actors pursue through disinformation campaigns? And if I might add a little bit of flavor to it, why do you believe that they think this works if the evidence is so unclear? Is there something that they know that we don't? And what is the goal that is trying to be used here? And where does this confidence come from to keep engaging in foreign disinformation if it is so unclear whether it works?
Just a few thoughts to start with. There are certainly these actors who do think that it may work or that it is worth trying, but as we elaborated earlier as well, it's not the only tool in their toolbox. They're using other means as well. And in the hybrid conduct of conflict that we're already in, and that targets, it's, for example, even a country like Switzerland, not being a member of NATO, not being a frontline state in Ukraine and so on, I think we see many other elements, and cyber attacks and acts of sabotage in Europe are other examples. So they're not just betting on this one card, but they are hoping that this one card contributes to a wider effect. Again, the objectifying human issue is, of course, it is not mechanical. It is not that easy, not that straightforward. So I would argue that for a case like Switzerland, but also others, there's very general sentiments of why the Russian leadership or state-sponsored actors in Russia who are engaging in disinformation, what they may hope to achieve, it is, of course, eroding support for Ukraine. It is sowing doubt in government policy, in cohesion within Europe, in transatlantic relations, and so on and so forth, and specifically in sanctions not being enacted or being abandoned for that reason. I think that's fairly obvious, but to use disinformation to achieve exactly that is tricky. But disinformation can, of course, help through all these steps in between, which is the erosion of trust and in specific governments and policies in Ukraine. Painting Ukraine as a Nazi evil, for example, obviously serves that purpose as well. So in all these narratives, we see a link with these potential goals that's not coming out of the blue. But again, as we've discussed earlier, it's not that straightforward. And they obviously want us to believe that they are achieving this effect, either because there's companies in St. Petersburg or so on whose whole business model relies on it. They have that interest, but also obviously Russian leadership. And going back to such autocratic regimes, they have a very simplistic view of citizens who they don't even call citizens, they're just people who are mechanic, as in they can easily be manipulated or subdued. We shouldn't fall into that trap.
So you think, Gavin, I see you smile and nod. I will let you go in it. But I think this is a really interesting thing. So part of it might also be a different understanding of how people, civilization, how society works in that case.
Indeed. And I would just kind of say, I like to draw the parallel with commercial advertising. The question is, if you know, why do people spend billions and billions of dollars on commercial advertising when there's scant evidence of if or how it works? And the unfortunate answer to that is because people are willing to pay. The answer to the question of why a 30-second advertisement costs $25 million during the Super Bowl, the answer to that question is because someone's willing to pay that. And not to sound like take too Marxist a tone on it, but the fact that so many people are engaged in it, they are chasing some degree of both political clout and funding, and that applies again to both propagandists and the counter-propagandist community as well. So I think again, sometimes the winning move is not to play, whereas for some of the propagandists, and certainly in Moscow and Beijing, because of that autocratic way they view societies, they view the only losing move is not to play in that arena.
I see. To kind of take a step back, nevertheless. I see. You mentioned, if I may, because I think that is a fair question. You mentioned Beijing right now, and it is true that I think we've been quite general regarding foreign disinformation when we kind of focused on us, on the kind of receiving or exposed countries, but we might have had a bit of a focus on especially Russian activities. I think both of your examples were linked to Russian actors. And now, one person in the Q&A asks, besides Russia, and both of you can argue on that, what are your views, or what are foreign disinformation activities by China in Switzerland and in Europe that might be of concern to you? Is it a whole other level? Is it mainly Russia that should be in our minds, or is it Russia and China as well? Is it other actors? What does the foreign disinformation landscape look like? And maybe also, if I may, do we see differences in the ways that Russia and China conduct their operations?
I certainly can't speak. I'm no expert on Chinese disinformation activities. I think in general, their approach is far more kind of transparently coercive. The effect is to kind of advance China's interests rather than necessarily to kind of chum the waters or, sow chaos. So I think their tactics tend to differ somewhat from Moscow's in that regard. All of that said, the caveats applying. I'm by no means a China expert, so I'm limited in my response there.
I see.
I would generally echo that from a Swiss perspective, as in they have different narratives that they try to portray different ways. It's not about sowing chaos. It is very often just generally about spreading a positive image of China. Much of this is very legitimate diplomacy. At times it may not be. What we're more worried about is what some coin transnational repression against very specific societal groups. For example, minorities, originating from the Chinese territory, whether that's Tibetans, for example, or Uyghur people, of which there are sizable communities in Switzerland, being targeted, being intimidated, trying to be pushed into a certain behavior that means they speak out less, that they don't openly criticize China, that we even know of instances where relatives who are still in China were used to intimidate their relatives here in Switzerland to not speak out against certain practices. And that, of course, being an infringement of free speech in our country, an infringement on human rights. And that's something we're concerned about, much less so than certain acts in disinformation and other spaces by Russia. So we need to distinguish, but there's certainly different ways, and some kind of influence does happen for sure.
Right, but it's not all via disinformation campaigns, right? I think this is also a very strong image to keep in mind, that influence operations and that influence in general, and that is one of the things that we are scared of when we talk about foreign disinformation, is achieved by whole other means rather than and in addition to disinformation as well. I think we've said this numerous times, and I think the Chinese example here is really indicative of showing us that it's one of many tools. I have received another priority question, this time for both people, which kind of goes into the direction where we talked about at the very beginning, that Western audiences and Western responses can amplify the reach and potential impact, whatever that is, but in any case, the reach of these information campaigns by an order of magnitude, to quote you, Gavin. Given that foreign disinformation can be amplified by Western attention, would you say that attribution is not always an effective means of deterrence by punishment?
I would say that. I think attribution sometimes just lends a lot of notoriety and cachet to the actors that kind of gives them, in the case of Doppelganger, of course, this gives them the marketing materials that they use to kind of keep going. So I think focusing on if we do consider it a threat, focusing on the financial and technological infrastructure and quietly dismantling that can sometimes simply be the best disinfectant rather than sunlight, which, as Thomas Rid, my good colleague and friend, likes to say, sunlight is a good disinfectant, but it also helps the weeds grow.
I see. I see. How do you view this, Benno? Should we not only talk about less, but also give them less credit, disinforming actors?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. I would generally agree with what Gavin said. Obviously, some kind of exposure to sunlight or other scrutiny can happen without very clear-cut attribution, as in you can reveal certain networks that existed between, let's say, fake accounts, doppelganger websites, and so on, without you having to call out a very specific government, specific agency doing it. Usually they go hand in hand, understandably so. But I would also argue that much of it should focus on the whole supply chain of it all, trying to disrupt what they're doing with technical means, through financial means, and so on and so forth. There again, Switzerland has a fairly liberal approach. There isn't much state intervention in that. We do embrace most sanctions that EU and others have acted against Russia, but for example, we haven't specifically sanctioned RT and Sputnik and the likes for pragmatic reasons as well, saying their reach isn't massive. They don't operate massively out of Switzerland. So we probably rather keep it as is rather than stirring up more attention around that. The only element that I think there is potential is, of course, when it comes to social media platforms who have an important role, who are an important intermediary, and where regulating them and making sure regulation is actually followed is a hard thing to do. But there is probably more room to make them even more responsible to an extent for what is happening, and make them a partner in all these efforts, because the disruption, of course, can happen at any time, and social media platforms are one of these elements in the chain.
Yeah, and it is important that if I understand correctly, sunlight, to remain with the metaphor, could be shown on that. That is important, that we know who it is who is doing this. Okay. So sunlight helps the weeds grow, and democracy kind of dies in darkness. And the solution to both of these things is to focus on the right part of it all. Very interesting. Maybe a last question before we might have to wrap up. Maybe we can even get two of them, depending on how it looks like. One question is, we've already looked at this a bit, but maybe we can expand on this a tad bit for Benno, but also for Gavin. If you take a look at Switzerland being particularly vulnerable or to foreign disinformation with its regular votes on issues, you've said before that while this is theoretically a vulnerability, we try to be constantly informing our citizens so that doesn't really happen. Where would you now, zooming out of Switzerland, locate the vulnerability or resilience, wherever this may be, and if that exists, in comparison to other countries in Europe? Do you think there's particular other countries that are particularly vulnerable or resilient, or just particularly exposed in, let's say, the western part of Europe?
Maybe I'm start with, but then I'm actually quite curious about how Gavin sees Switzerland within that whole framework. We argue that from these regular votes, of course, there could be a certain vulnerability, as in the population does decide on major issues, and specific influence activities can target on exactly that. So it's tempting to target Switzerland, possibly related to such a vote, even though we haven't seen specific indicators of it. The other thing is that there is a structural resilience somewhat in the system. It's also a decentralized political system. We have 4 national languages. We vote on state level, we vote at federal level, we vote at local level. All of that is really messy and goes against the grain of centralized authoritarian states who ideally just push one button and then achieve a certain outcome with millions of people. So I'd say structurally fairly resilient, but I wouldn't say that Swiss individuals as such fare much better than your average European when it comes to recognizing this information, being aware of attempts of manipulation, and so on and so forth. I would argue that there we're all in the same boat.
Yeah, I would just foot stomp. I think the prospects of a whole of society kind of resilient response tend to look a little bit more easily implementable in certain kinds of structures and in certain states that are more homogenous culturally, if not ethnically. And so it's very difficult to kind of compare apples and oranges in that way across Europe. But I do think, as Benno says, there are certain states that have a lot of structural advantages and historical kind of unifying forces that help them respond, I think, with more confidence and more kind of calmness, if you will, to some of these threats.
Okay, so it is not just, but this is very good news then, right? It's not just the Swiss context where citizens are fed information all the time and that kind of makes them resilient. There seems to be a general, not impenetrability, but perhaps there seems to be a general trend of people not being as gullible as we believe that we are. As we are reaching the last 2 minutes of our talk, I do unfortunately believe that we have to end quite sharply at 13:30. I would love to maybe wrap this up. Thank you very much for all the submissions that have gone into the Q&A. To maybe wrap up a bit, we've talked about risks and responses now. We've talked about the both under and overestimated facts and realized that disinformation is fuzzy because, well, disinformation is a great deal of things that we do not know. It's really hard to measure. But that doesn't mean that we don't know anything. We know that disinformation is just one tool of many, and that we shouldn't forget that we shouldn't view disinformation as the one thing that actually might influence millions of people, but that it is much more nuanced than that, and that we might be able to view it as such. It is something, but not entirely new. Disinformation in the year 2025 is not something that has not existed in this form previously. And even though new technologies do matter, they do not determine anything. And that's really important because it means that we can learn from the past to draw lessons from the future. That's very good news. I think it's also very good news that the way that we might tackle disinformation is by really making sure our foundations are solid, that there is trust, both from citizens in institutions and, as we've discussed importantly, vis-a-vis, that we might battle and combat disinformation best by doing our job right as governments and by being really sure that we talk about it correctly. And if it is a lesson that we should talk less or less intensely about disinformation, I do believe that it would be a good idea to end this webinar quite quickly in that case. Before we do, very briefly, you will in the next couple of days perhaps receive an email with a couple of follow-up questions, including what you like us to talk about next. The only thing I can do right now is to thank wholeheartedly Gavin and Benno for having taken such an amazing part of their day with us, for having taken and given us their lunchtime. Thank you very much for having been there. It's been a pleasure. For you, dear viewers, all I can say is stay critical, stay true, dare to ignore sometimes, dare to be boring, and please don't forget to still have fun while doing so. It's been a pleasure. See you very soon.
An honor. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.